People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Everybody's talking at me. I don't hear a word they're saying, only the echoes of my mind. It's your misfortune and none of my own.
Where's that Joe Buck?
Where's that Joe Buck?
Yeah, where's that Joe Buck? I'm Joe Buck from Texas.
Ratso Rizzo, from the Bronx.
Are you sure you heard what I said?
My name's Rizzo.
Now you heard him.
His name is Joe Buck. He's a cowboy. Just came in from Texas.
Cowboy, huh? I ain't a for real cowboy. But I am one hell of a stud.
Kiss me, Joe. Kiss me.
Hell, the only one thing I ever been good for is loving.
Oh, you're the only one, Joe.
And how come you ain't scored once the whole time you've been in New York?
Cause I need management.
Let's go.
Hey, I'm walking here. I'm walking here.
Listen. Get the cash. Those rich ladies write out a check a night, and in the morning they call the bank and stop payment.
You were going to ask me for money?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I mean business.
You were going to ask me for money.
M-O-N-Y.
You big Texas longhorn bull.
They're laughing at you on the street.
What you got me up here for? Ready for some hard work, son? I'm ready for anything.
You're a nice person, Joe. I should never have asked you up here.
It's going to be a lot easier for you, Joe Buck.
You're a lovely person, really.
I'm going to use you. I'm going to run you ragged.
Where you been, 42nd Street?
I'm a truly dangerous person, I am.
I'm impressed. You're a killer.
Guess who I am?
Oh,
It's me.
she's hooked.
Like why, cowboy?
I'd say she was good for $10, but I'll ask for 20.
Why are you laughing, Joe? You're really a cowboy.
Hey, listen, don't get sore or anything, okay?
I ain't sore.
I don't think I can walk anymore. I'm scared.
What are you scared of?
You know what they do to you when they know you can't. When they find out that you can't walk. Oh, Christ.
Backing up on the northeast winds, sailing on the summer breeze, skipping over the ocean like a stone. Everybody's talking at me.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike Voight. Joining me once again is Mr. Chris Stachiw.
Can you tell me the way to the Statue of Liberty?
Also joining us is Mr. Jon Towlson.
Yeah, whoopity-io, boy, whoopity-io.
On this special episode of the projection booth, we are looking at John Schlesinger's Midnight Cowboy. It is the story of Joe Buck, a hustler from Texas who makes his way to the Big Apple in order to, I guess, get laid a lot and make a lot of money and live out a dream and really, more than anything, make connections with people and end his terrible loneliness that he has suffered for almost all of his life. We will be spoiling this film as we go along, so if you don't want anything ruined, please go ahead and track down the movie, come on back, and we will still be here. So, Chris, when was the first time you saw Midnight Cowboy, sir?
It's one of those movies that's definitely been on a list of things to watch. I think at this point in 2023, everybody knows Dustin Hoffman's line from the movie. I'm not even going to reference it, because if anybody listening knows anything cursory about this movie, they probably know that line, right? I guess maybe the Harry Nilsson song, but I also can't imagine that the Harry Nilsson song is as associated with this movie all the time now in 2023, the way it probably was back in the day. But just recently, you invited me to be on this episode, and I took it as the opportunity to finally watch the movie. And it's a lot. It's a lot in a way that a lot of these kinds of movies from this time are movies that are important for a number of reasons. And I'm sure that there will be many reasons that we will talk about that I'm not even currently even thinking about, because there are multiple angles to come at this movie from, obviously. The Vietnam angle, the gay angle, obviously, which I'm sure we will talk about, given that I am gay, and I know we're going to have a huge discussion about kind of the homosexual tones of the movie. So I enjoyed it. I will say it's a lot, but I think it's meant to be a lot for a number of reasons. It's not meant to be a movie that you just watch unassumingly. It is an entertaining movie. It is again, I don't know if it's a fun movie, but the performances are what carry the movie through. And man, that Jon Voight guy, whatever happened to him? I heard he was on a boat with an anaconda eventually. I don't know. Jon Voight has had a weird career. I have not seen him in a whole lot. And now I understand why Jon Voight had a career that lasted as long as still has. Because if this is one of the things you're known for, again, Dustin Hoffman is known for a lot of things. But if he were just known for this, that would be enough, is my point. I think that's how important this movie at least presents itself, is received as such. But just recently, and I enjoyed it immensely. It's not a movie that takes itself lightly, and I don't think the audience should expect to just wander into Midnight Cowboy for a good old romp, because it's not that, but it's, in a lot of ways, if that's all you're getting from it, you might be missing the point somewhat.
And Jon, how about yourself? When was the first time you saw it, and what did you think?
Yeah, probably around about 1984, I think. It was showing in a little cinema in the small town I grew up in the East Midlands in the UK, a town called Grantham. It's probably best known as the birthplace of former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
Try not to hold it against them.
Yeah, well, tells you everything you need to know about the town, really. And the town had a little cinema called the Paragon, which was, it wasn't much more than a cowshed that had been built a couple of years before. They used to show occasional sort of repertory screenings, and I used to go along as a young film buff. And I remember they showed The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which was one of the first time I saw that. And then this movie, Midnight Cowboy, which I'd heard of, but I'd never seen and didn't really know anything about. And I went to see it with a very close friend of mine, and we were completely engrossed in it. And I think that screening changed me in a way. It was really an extraordinary moment. What struck me about the film, the themes of it, the loneliness, the kind of repressed homoeroticism of it, they all hit me quite strongly, because I was about 16, I think, 16 or 17 at the time. And the performances, because me and my friend, we were studying acting at the local college, and we wanted to be in the theatre, and we were just really struck by the relationship, I think, between Joe Buck and Ratso. And we left the cinema and we became Joe Buck and Ratso in the way we related to each other. We adopted those persona, and my friend did a particularly good sort of nasal twang of Dustin Hoffman. You want a cup of coffee? And I'm walking here, all of that kind of thing. So the film really, really hit me hard and resonated really, really deeply with me. And as I became more interested in movies and started making movies of my own, I really started to study the film. And I remember just being really taken by the editing techniques of it, the use of the camera, and so on and so forth. It was just one of those films that I just thought, if I ever want to write a book, I want to write a book about Midnight Cowboy. And I ended up writing a book about it, and specifically talking about the themes of it from a sort of queer perspective. And it's been quite a long journey, quite an interesting journey for me, that film. And I think what I saw in it is what a lot of people saw in it, in terms of Joe, identifying with the character of Joe Buck. So yeah, a seminal film for me.
I think I saw this one probably on VHS when I was maybe 16, 17 years old, and definitely liked it, but I really didn't know what to make of it quite a bit. It had such an odd flow to it, just that we start in Texas, we follow Joe, but then we get those flashbacks throughout, well, even right from the very beginning, we are flashing through past, present, maybe even a little bit of future when he is quitting his busboy job and fantasizing about what he wants to say to his boss. Yeah, that editing style really captivated me and really made me appreciate what good editing can do. And then also this film operates on such a great level when it comes to the audio and just the contraposing of the commercials with the action on screen. But then you also get the advertisements as far as the billboards, whether it be on Joe's journey across the country via the bus or whether it's the billboards that are in New York City. You constantly have things outside of Joe Buck commenting on Joe Buck's story, which I love. And I saw it again. They must have done like a 50th anniversary screening because I definitely remember seeing this on the big screen. So maybe 2009 would have been the 50th anniversary. Or no, 2019 would have been the 50th anniversary, but I know I saw it. Maybe it was the 40th anniversary of it then, because I definitely saw it theatrically, and seeing it on the big screen is amazing. The cinematography is fantastic. It's so well put together. And yeah, it's always been part of my life. And then you see it parodied in things like Seinfeld or other things. I mean, the Seinfeld one, I used to love when they would do movie parodies because they would just kind of come out of nowhere. The whole thing of like the door closing on Kramer's apartment and it's the end scene from The Godfather, things like that. But the whole thing of, I think it was it was Jerry and Kramer on the bus. And it just is that whole end scene from, I mean, one of the most heartbreaking end scenes of a movie ever when it comes to Midnight Cowboy, and then they turn it into a joke, but it was a good joke. This movie, obviously it's been there all my life, came out in 1969. So Midnight Cowboy has been part of the cultural discussion since I was a kid. It was nice to finally sit down and watch this more with a critical eye and just see how they were putting this movie together, and then to read your book, to read Joe Frankel's book, to watch the documentary about it, just to learn about all of the things that were going on behind the scenes. And I am really curious as far as, I want to talk to you about your reading of it, because it's an odd experience that it was based on a book by a gay writer. It was directed by a gay director. You have gay themes in here, but then your two main characters have a relationship, but it's more, I guess, homoerotic than homosexual. And then there's Ratso is just so homophobic all the time. I mean, just dropping the F word like crazy through this entire movie. It was kind of wild to think about that relationship that these two guys had. And yeah, just to watch this as a masterclass of acting, it's incredible.
So I had obviously heard that it had a place in queer cinema, but as someone who had never seen it, I didn't know what to expect going into it as how it would identify itself as queer cinema. And I think it, in some respects, bristles at the fact that I don't know. Again, you mentioned a lot of the people involved are queer. And so I know why the movie got an X rating. And that was one of the horrible reasons it got an X rating, because, oh my God, I mean, the queer lifestyle and other people might turn out to be gay. Like, yeah, correct. Especially if they're seeing it presented in a way that isn't constantly derogatory. Jesus Christ. But it is weird because, to your point, like there's a lot of homophobia in the movie, and it does more or less come from Dustin Hoffman's character. But if they're presenting it in a very matter-of-fact way, it's just the relationship between the two main characters is not the typical relationship of 1969. And that might be at least like the most basic way, right? It's just these two guys have a different relationship. And then I would err on the side of it's a very homoerotic queer relationship. But again, the movie seems to not want to necessarily go all the way, which again, I understand, but at the same time, doesn't make it any less queer cinema.
It's almost like a retelling of The Odd Couple, when you get into the apartment scenes, the condemned apartment with Ratso and Joe. It's very Felix and Oscar as far as, neither one of them is very fastidious, but at least, Ratso has his whole thing like where he won't change his clothes in front of Joe. He has to have a private room. He wants his private area that he can change his underwear in and those kind of things. Yeah. And then to think that this came out, I think this came out the same year as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So you've got these templates for buddy films going on here, because I know we've had buddies before in cinema before this, but really this, to me, kicks off a whole new era of buddy films. You're going to start seeing, like You're Busting or Freebie and the Bean or these kind of things where you start to get people that are paired in these unlikely situations and they become fast friends, or eventually, reluctant friends, but eventually friends by the end. I mean, the relationship, so much of this movie for me is Joe Buck learning how to care for other people and be cared for, because we get this whole thing of him as a young child. And I love the way that they use flashbacks in this, because it could be a narrative, start at the beginning with little Joe Buck growing up. And, you get that kid in front of the very first opening shot where you have that amazing shot of the drive-in movie screen, and you have the little kid on the horse in front of it who's just dwarfed by that screen. I mean, to me, that is Joe Buck. I don't know if it's supposed to be, but that is him there in front of this big, wide, lonely movie screen on his little horse rocking back and forth. And then you get to see how he's dumped off by his, apparently his mother. Like, he doesn't even know in the book who his mother is. He's got 3 mothers, basically, and then they drop him off at Sally Buck's place, and that becomes this relationship. And the whole thing, I mean, there's this weird incestuous stuff, the way she calls him lover boy. But I like that we get all this stuff doled out through the movie, and we get to have those things compared against what is happening in his life at that moment. What is bringing on those thoughts? So I really like that we are following Joe. And sometimes I don't even know if he's privy to some of those things that we are seeing, or if we're just being told, this is what happened to him, and now look at what's going on in his life right now.
I think a lot of that sort of associative editing that's in the film sort of arises from Schlesinger trying to find some sort of cinematic equivalent to the novel, a sort of novelistic stream of consciousness way of getting inside Joe Buck's head, getting inside his past, what makes him tick, and so on. A lot of that probably evolved during the filming. I don't know how much of it is apparent in the script, quite linear. They had a lot of problems with the editing. The original edit really didn't see eye to eye with what Schlesinger wanted, and Schlesinger brought in his editor he'd worked with in the past. But as a film buff, I find it quite intriguing that the film that Schlesinger had made before Midnight Cowboy was far from the madding crowd, and Nicholas Roeg was the cinematographer on that movie. And a lot of the editing in Midnight Cowboy is very Nicholas Roegian, I guess you could say. Sense of this association, the fact that it's almost like a kind of intellectual montage of what's going on in the consciousness of the character. So I do wonder what kind of conversations Schlesinger and Roeg had while they were making Far From the Madding Crowd, because Schlesinger was already developing Midnight Cowboy as a script while he was shooting that film, and even before then. And some of the problems of adaptation from novel to film were probably things he was working through. I've heard people say it feels a little bit old-fashioned now, Midnight Cowboy, because of that editing style that seems like Nouvelle Vague, sort of new wave, French new wave. Something, I guess you don't see it much now. You don't see it very often. But at the time, it was probably a little bit more familiar to audiences than it is now. So audiences probably accept that kind of to and fro in time, that sort of moving around in time thing.
I like it a lot, and I think it works really well to allow us to get inside the head of Joe Buck. And again, obviously, this, for as much as Dustin Hoffman does I think, steal the show in a lot of ways. It is so much Jon Voight's movie and Joe Buck's movie, and all of that. We don't see any Ratso flashbacks for a reason. It's Joe Buck because he's the main character, because we see the entire story through his eyes. And would the movie have worked just as well for me in terms of it being a narrative about his character if there hadn't been flashbacks? Probably. But again, getting inside the character's head just gives you that one more kind of turn of the dial to get a fully realized character. And it is a fully realized character. Even watching those early screen tests, I don't think anybody else could have played this role, at least not the way that it's played here. And obviously, that goes without saying, because if anybody else had played it, it would have been markedly different. But the sense of childlike wonderment that Joe Buck has is really reinforced by seeing his perverse childhood, one might say, or childhood, that atypical childhood. Again, not to make cast aspersions, but it just goes to reinforce this is where this guy came from, and this is why he's reacting the way that he is. And again, did I need that? No, but it just helps to further reinforce that this guy there is very little pretext and pretense to this guy, like, at all. He is just wandering around, just amazed by everything. And that's perfectly fine. But boy, a guy like that in a city like that, and that's what happens.
Well, a city like that, and a city at that time, I mean, the late 60s in New York City was a real rough time. And we've talked about, obviously, Chris talking about Barney Miller, some of the stuff that was going on in New York in the 70s, but it was right there in the 60s as well, especially in the late 60s, especially seeing Times Square, seeing all those hustlers just hanging out in front of the movie theaters. And they really capture that so well. And I think that the work of the DP on this was just so well done to get that kind of wash of neon through everything. And just even to see some of those things like Joe walking along and he's got his radio and everything. And then we cut from night to day and he's almost in the exact same place, this beautiful match cut. And then cut from that back to night, back to day, back to night, just to show that passage of time that he is just out there every single day, pounding the pavement, looking for tricks and not finding anything.
I think the DP had quite a lot of trouble with his crew initially because he wanted to do things a little differently. And this is where, Midnight Cowboy was a kind of a forerunner. I think it's a progenitor for the sort of new queer cinema that came in the 90s with things like My Own Private Idaho, but it's also a big forerunner for the sort of new American cinema as well. And DPs like Vilmos Zsigmond and Haskell Wexler would plough the same furrow as Adam Hollander did in Midnight Cowboy, and they were essentially using still photography techniques and using available light and filming into the sun and getting camera flare in the lens. All these things were considered to be unprofessional by Hollywood standards in the late 1960s. And I think Hollander was, as well as Schlesinger, they found it really tough going with their New York crew, who were seasoned film crew used to certain ways of doing things. But along come these guys want to bring some sort of new realism to the film, and having to go against a lot of the conventions of the late 1960s. But I think it does lead to this extraordinary sort of dazzling visual technique that's not only, it's not just flashy, it actually brings a lot to the movie in terms of the kind of intellectual content of the movie, the commentary on the character, the commentary on the life and times that you just get through the contrast of the sound and the image, as you say, that sort of political commentary that's running through the film about the economics of the city, where at one point he's walking along and they're saying, eat steak every day. They can barely put a meal on the table. Schlesinger really wanted to put a lot into that film, and he just used every kind of cinematic means to his disposal to do it, and invented new ones along with his crew. And I think The key people are Adam Hollander and the editor and the production designer of the film, who just went against some of the kind of accepted ways of doing things. And the actors, of course, who just... Dustin Hoffman, we all know the lengths to which he would go in his sort of method, but he really does become the character and dresses as the character and refused to not be the character. Even during the sort of lunch breaks, they'd go off to the local restaurant. They couldn't afford to have a caterer on set, so they used to go and eat at the local restaurant. Hoffman used to turn up as Ratso and embarrass the rest of the cast and crew by sitting there in the restaurant eating and drinking as Ratso would. So, yeah, an extraordinary film.
It's amazing, too, that this was the follow-up to The Graduate. We're going to cover The Graduate in 2024, and that this was the role that he took next. It was almost the role that he took first. He actually, or his agent, called Schlesinger's people and were just like, hey, he really wants this role, but he's got this call for The Graduate, can we make this work? And it's like, oh, don't worry, very far, it's very nascent stages for Midnight Cowboy. So he went ahead, did The Graduate, became almost like a little sex symbol after The Graduate, which is kind of tough for me to imagine, thinking of Dustin Hoffman with all the roles that I grew up with him in. The sex symbol stuff aside, he was a huge hit for him, The Graduate was. And then to take this as his next role, pretty risky. But I really like that he really showed his range just within his first two films. And then he would just go on from there to, Little Big Man, Lenny, Kramer versus Kramer, Tootsie. He constantly, Straight Time is one that we talked about on the show a long time ago. He just could do so many different types of roles. It was fantastic. And the thing that, Chris, you're talking about, this is all from Joe Buck's POV. And that's true, except for one point, which is that there's a moment where we get a Ratso fantasy. We have a lot of Joe Buck fantasies, a lot of Joe Buck's dreams, nightmares, but we get a moment of Ratso, which starts off as a dream, like a very pleasant experience, and then ends up being a nightmare. And I like that we are cross-cutting that with what's happening in real life, and just that is affecting him, seeing Joe possibly screw up a deal with a potential client, and his Ratso's dream starts to slowly change into him being by this pool and all these ladies calling out to him, or him on the beach with Joe. And I love that moment when he's running and he looks back at Joe because, in his fantasy, both of his legs work really well, so well that he's beating Joe in this foot race. And you get this great John Barry music, this kind of light and fluffy thing that's going on. And then it starts to change where the women are more demanding, and pretty soon he's being almost chased by them into the pool, and that's where the fantasy ends, and that's where he thinks that life is crashing down around his ears again. I love that they have that, because otherwise it is all Joe Buck all the time. And by the way, just as an aside, there's another Joe Buck that's out there in the world, like a real guy named Joe Buck. I think he's like a sports announcer or something.
For the MLB, yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I would see Joe Buck trending on Twitter all the time, and I would just be like, what's going on? What's going on with Midnight Cowboy? I had no idea that there was this other Joe Buck out in the world, but apparently there's two.
It's really popular with the Twitter crowd.
Is his catch line, where's that Joe Buck? Where's that Joe Buck? Where is that Joe Buck?
I do think, though, Mike, to your point about The Graduate and this movie coming back to back for Dustin Hoffman, obviously The Graduate, it's a movie I haven't seen in quite some time, but in the documentary about Midnight Cowboy that came out last year, they talk about The Graduate and they talk about this movie a lot. The idea that The Graduate ends on is one of, again, Hello Darkness, My Old Friend. We go back to that old ditty right there at the end. It's not hard to understand what the movie's getting at in the final frames of The Graduate. And then I think if you were to transition directly from that movie to this movie, in a lot of ways, it has that same idea. It almost ends the same way, with two people on a bus going off into their future together. Just in this one of them doesn't make it, but that might be the kindest gesture of all, is that they don't make it. At the beginning of this movie, obviously, we have the character feeling an immense amount of loneliness. And then by the end of the movie, wouldn't say he's in any different of a spot. I would say that the loneliness may be even more deep and immense because now he has had that moment of connection with someone, and he has gone as far as one human being could go for another person, as far as I'm concerned. And then again, it ends on the same note of you're embracing your friend's dead body, but there's still that immense note of loneliness because again, what does he do now? And I like that's where the movie leaves us with him. And the same way it leaves us in The Graduate. I don't need to see anymore. I can imagine what happens, but I know that loneliness is involved at a cellular level. For all of the queer tones of this movie, I think the sense of otherness, which promotes a sense of loneliness within people who feel other, regardless of the otherness that they feel, I think is an important, especially in this day and age, as close as we all are and as far as we've come, feeling other is still a thing, and being made to feel lesser because of your otherness is still a thing. That sense of loneliness it's ever encompassing. It's at every turn. Every corner, there is a sense of loneliness that these characters are trying to escape. And again, I think maybe the theme of the movie and the takeaway is you can never escape it. You can only, I don't know, maybe prolong the lack of loneliness that you're feeling. Because I don't think anybody's ever not lonely. I think it's just how unlonely are you and for how long? Because I think it's just a matter of at some point you have to deal with it. And I think that's obviously where these movies leave these characters is now you have to deal with it again. So how are you going to go about dealing with it? I like those two kind of similar ideas being explored. I just think this movie, obviously, like it's at the core of this movie, maybe more so than it is at the core of The Graduate.
I think there's maybe kind of an ambiguity towards the end of Midnight Cowboy. I think what you've just said is really valid, and it adds so much to the film in terms of the power of the film that he's left on his own again. And you really feel that sense of loss because you thought this was it. He was going to find somebody at last that he could relate to and be with, even though it is a bittersweet ending for me because the thing is that he's gone through this journey for me, which is the fact that he has had this relationship with Ratso, whereas before he really didn't have anybody and he didn't even really understand how to relate to anybody. He just thought that he was only worth selling his body to somebody, and that was the only thing he was worth. But by the end of it, for me, Joe Buck has gone through a journey where he's learned in a way to love somebody and allowed them to love him. So for me, it's not a happy ending, but it's an ending where there is the possibility of a better life for him now. He's given up this fantasy of becoming a hustler in New York, which was never going to work anyway. We all knew that, and the audience kind of knows that. And he's going on to maybe starting a new life. And the fact that he may well meet somebody and find things easier this time around because he's overcome some of his problems from his past as well in the course of his relationship with Ratso. But again, that I think the beauty of the film is it does have the ambiguity where you can read into it so many different kind of conclusions in a way and draw from it what's important to you as a person. Just as a sort of side note, in the book that I wrote, what I found really interesting was one of the big fans of the film is Tom Savini, who's the best special effects makeup artist of Dawn of the Dead and all the rest of it. And Savini had gone to Vietnam and come back sort of a shell of a person. He had to turn off his emotions in order to survive being in Vietnam. But when he came back, he found that he couldn't turn his emotions back on, and he just drifted through his life as a sort of zombie in his own way. And his marriage fell apart, and eventually he found himself in a movie theater watching a movie, and he just burst into tears, and suddenly all of his emotions suddenly came back to him when the movie was Midnight Cowboy. So I think it's a film that is very cathartic for people in so many different ways, and there's the queer reading, but there's all sorts of different ways in which that film connects to people, which is, I think, maybe what Schlesinger realized why he didn't want it to be seen as just like a queer movie. Thought it would be. It had much wider appeal to audiences of all types.
when you look at Joe Buck's relationships throughout the entire movie, I mean, he's used. He's used constantly. You've got Bob Balaban who gives him the blowjob, but he has no money, and Joe Buck lets him go. It doesn't even take his watch because his parents would be mad. The very first woman that he successfully picks up, Sylvia Miles, she ends up getting $20 from him. She doesn't pay for his services. She pays for hers. And it's just, there's so many of these times. Bernard Hughes towards the end of the movie. I mean, even when you look at the scene with one of the scenes with his grandmother, she leaves money, a mantle, which so reminds me of, you know, your money's on the dresser kind of thing. You know, like, okay, there's a TV dinner in the oven, honey. Here's some money. And then she leaves. I mean, he's just being used over and over and over again. And then he's got that connection with Crazy Annie, the Jennifer Salt character. And that one, that's fascinating to me. This whole thing of him being part of this gang, and they have this orgy with her, and she seems to really fall for him. And she keeps saying, like, you're the only one, you're the only one. And then later on, there's an assault by the rest of the gang on Joe Buck and Crazy Annie. And the cops are there, and I think she basically accuses Joe at that point unknowingly, because she says he's the one, he's the only one. And I don't think he goes to jail for that by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't think that that is part of the book, because I was curious to see if that was in there. There is a gang rape, but there isn't this, let's say, gang bang rather than gang rape, because I think Crazy Annie is very into that. That's her kink, is being with all of these different people. But I don't think that that retaliation is there. And especially Joe Buck being raped by the people that used to be his friends. Instead, what happens is one of the guys who is there at the gangbang, he approaches Joe Buck, and he wants to be used the same way that Joe Buck used Crazy Annie. So basically, Joe Buck fucks this guy. And then when the guy gets married, like 3 weeks later, I think they say in the book, Joe's very hurt that he wasn't invited to the wedding, because he has no idea. He's just a piece of meat a lot of times. You know, he's just this empty shell, and he wants to make these connections. He thinks that he has a connection with this guy. He thinks he has a connection with Crazy Annie, but then things happen and they are either taken away or go away, and he's left completely devastated.
Even the idealized idea of what this guy has in his mind of what he will find in New York. My podcast is pro sex worker. Your podcast is pro sex worker, obviously. But if you are a sex worker, this is the idealized world that you would like to live in, is what he's believing waits for him in New York. All of these gorgeous older women who want a young man, a good-looking blonde-haired guy to show up and have sex with them because they're bored. That's his perception of what's going on. Now, is he a big dumb hick from Texas? Maybe. But again, like, everybody's got to have a dream. Everybody's got to have an idealized situation that they would like to live in. And that's his. And yeah, when he gets there, the reality is the people that will be using you are the one, they will be using you, dude, not the other way around. And it's that he doesn't realize it fast enough, or he never realizes it at all. But again, that's the point of one of the points of the movie. But I like that idea of this guy just can't seem to figure it out either, because again, like, to figure it out would mean to escape this situation that you find yourself in. And he is not capable of figuring it out because he doesn't have the tools yet. And again, like, he starts to create that relationship with Ratso, which helps him, like you mentioned, John, transform as a character. But it's that relationship that helps him transform. He can't do it on his own, clearly, because he's a guy who moved to New York City thinking that there were just going to be lines of older women lined up ready to have sex with him, which so far from reality, it never even happens.
In the book, the Ratso relationship's not as central as it is in the movie. Ratso doesn't even enter the book until like halfway through. But in the movie, I think what Schlesinger does is he says, no, actually, Ratso is the pivotal character. He's the character that enables Joe to overcome the things that have happened to him in the past. And I think there's also that sense that in the film, Joe is much more homophobic than the character is in the book. In the book, Joe is essentially bisexual, or you could call him omnisexual. And it's not a problem for him, actually, having sex with men or women. Whereas in the film, it's a big problem for him having sex with men. And it's a problem he has to overcome, really. He has to overcome that homophobia in order to allow his feelings for Ratso to fully develop, allow him to reciprocate in essentially what Ratso's feelings are for him. There's a really extraordinary moment in the film, which is where Ratso's helping Joe to get ready to go and be an escort, and he's helped him get his clothes clean, and he's cut his hair, all of these kind of domestic scenes. And then Ratso, you get this love shot of Ratso gazing almost adoringly at Joe, and he's going, "Not bad for a cowboy." That close-up is so important because you realize at that point, actually, Ratso really does adore Joe. Not necessarily in a sexual way, but he needs him. But Joe is like, his relationship with Ratso is that Joe doesn't realize what it is to be loved. He can't reciprocate it because he's never known it. And so he takes it for granted in a way. He takes Ratso for granted. And the big threat in a way in the film is less so in the book. Is Joe going to walk away from Ratso? Is he actually going to unwittingly walk away from the one person who's only ever cared for him in his whole life? And eventually he doesn't. And the Barnard Hughes character is so important. I see the Barnard Hughes character as being almost a kind of a symmetrical character to the Bob Balaban character earlier. These two repressed gay guys, repressed. This is what you will be like if you repress your feelings. And Joe is in danger of becoming those two characters if he represses his feelings. And eventually he breaks away from that in order to choose Ratso. And that's what he does at the end. He chooses Ratso over his dream of making it as a hustler with rich women in New York. And so for me, that's why the movie's quite an optimistic film, because it's about Joe's ability to learn how to love. Which that lyric in Nature Boy, the greatest thing you can ever learn is to love and be loved in return. A simple sentiment, but for me, that's what makes the film tick.
I like to, when he is making that trip to Miami, that he sheds his skin one last time, because he has been, since pretty much the very first time we see him, even when we see him in flashbacks, he's in costume of some sort. He's got a little cowboy hat, or I want to say he's in like a little army uniform or something when he's just a kid. But, you know, we mostly see him in that cowboy getup, and he is not a cowboy whatsoever, but he knows that appeals, knows that that's a trope, and tries to put on that trope. And he gets to see other guys, other hustlers on 42nd Street doing it much better than him. We get to see other people in cowboy regalia, and they don't look nearly as garish as he does. He's got that fringe jacket, you know, John Wayne don't have nothing on my fringe game, hello, like one of those types of things. And he just looks, he's cartoon. He's basically a cartoon character. And even when he meets Ratso the first time, and it's just like, well, I'm Joe Buck, I'm going to buy you a drink. What do you think about that? And it's just like, he's so big. And it's the whole thing of him getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then eventually just getting rid of that cowboy outfit until he becomes somebody else. And I am very curious. This is one of those movies where you wonder, and Chris, you touched on this before, you wonder what happens 5 minutes later. What happens 5 minutes, 5 days, 5 years after this movie ends? Because we don't know. Does he ever adjust? Does he ever find friendship? Does he find love? Who does he find love with? What does it matter? Just, yeah, it's takes that slice of just a few, I guess it would be a few months of Joe Buck's life, but then you get those flashbacks that builds it out to his whole life. But really, those few months of him in New York trying to make it and not making it, it just really gives you such a wonderful slice of life of these, like you were saying before, these fully formed characters where you feel like you know, and you feel like they know everything that has ever happened in their lives. Love, you don't get flashbacks of Ratso like you were saying, but you do get stories of Ratso. You get him visiting his father's grave, and it seems to be like, I know that I'm not going to make it. I'm visiting my father's grave for the last time. And then that he even steals the flowers off of the other grave and just uses it. It's such a Ratso thing to do. And you get his story about his dad breathing in the wax from the shoe shining. And I love the shoe shining scene, especially when the cop sits down next to Joe. And you get that look on Ratso's face. And then the third guy sits down, and he does a great job of shining those shoes, but does not want to become his own father, does not want to have his father's fate. I love those moments in here. And this whole movie is filled with little moments where you're just like, oh, that was a great scene, or that was a great moment. Like when they're dancing to the frozen orange juice commercial song while they're freezing their asses off in that shitty apartment, condemned apartment, I should say. Yeah, those kind of things just bring this whole movie life.
When I like the idea that Ratso is actively avoiding what he perceives to be his father's fate, but in the end, the fate that befalls him doesn't live even half as long. Like I'll just go off of the age of Dustin Hoffman around the time that this movie came out. So the guy's in his late 20s, early 30s, like his dad lived longer than that. Again, it's that weird idea of I'm avoiding this thing that I don't want to turn into, but in not wanting to turn into that, I have become something, I am much worse, but something that is even more injurious to my health, because again, like he's smoking and he has a limp, and we don't know what so many of these things, what is really going on is again left up to ambiguity, which I think is smart, because again, it allows us to project or infer or however you want to interpret it. But I like that the movie also just doesn't necessarily need to say what he's dealing with specifically. We just see him through the usage of the filmic language, watch him slowly deteriorate on screen. And it's showing, not telling. And I appreciate it because, again, like Dustin Hoffman's performance is, again, you both mentioned it already. I think he is the main character of the movie in a lot of ways. Like, he is the one who pushes so much of the movie forward because he has to. He's almost at the end of the day, like the sacrifice that the movie needs to make for Joe Buck to have that transformative moment is someone has to pay for it. And Ratso just happens to be the one. And he's willing. And in a lot of ways, you wonder if he's willing to make that sacrifice as a character. And I don't think he would want to, but the way it's shown, it's like someone has to make a sacrifice for these two guys to get what they want. Joe Buck makes his sacrifice, and then Ratso's is, again, like the ultimate sacrifice. But I think ultimately he is the main character of the movie. It's just he has such a transformative part of Buck's like journey in the movie that they're not able to be really removed from one another.
I think there is, as well, going back to what you were saying about him being on 42nd Street, there's that, and the whole thing about hustling in the way it's presented in the movie is that they're trapped by their economic circumstances. You know that Joe, he's not going to make it as a hustler because he just doesn't know the ropes. And there's a lot of competition there. And he's unwilling anyway to go there to do what he needs to do to be success as a hustler. And Ratso is unwilling to follow in his father's footsteps and be a shoe shine because he thinks he can be trapped, but he's trapped in something even more dire economically. So I think there's really that kind of sense of entrapment in the film that just pervades the film for me, which comes from their economic circumstances. So that colors the whole feeling of the film, that you feel that they've gone to this, they're trapped in New York. They want to escape the place. They want to go to this almost utopia that they think it's going to be coconuts and orange juice. And they've no idea the reality of going there. But at the end, this oppressive feeling of being trapped is so hard to escape in the film that you feel that the ending is colored by that whole sense of entrapment. But the thing is, at least they have each other. And that comes through in the book as well. In one of the segments in the book, never made it into the film, where Joe goes to this place where there's a kind like a mother and father double act who, I don't know, pimping these young girls out. And Joe's kind of sitting there in his place thinking, what an awful place, but at least the mother and father have got each other, even in this dark place. And I think that's the thing that kind of pervades the film, is that even somewhere as rotten as New York is in the way it's portrayed in the film in that era, at least Joe and Ratso have each other until they don't. And then, so that what you get, the ending could be perceived as kind of a downer.
You've got those other characters that are in the book, like Perry, the guy who basically seems like Satan himself sometimes, just the way that I can bring you whatever you want, Joe, whatever you want, just let me know and I'll make sure that it happens. And that goes into this whole thing of Joe wanting to get laid and this mother and son, when you've got this very strange relationship between this mother and son, which really echoes some other relationships from earlier James Leo Herlihy stuff. I was unfamiliar with him and with his work, and so doing this episode really opened up that for me, and seeing more of his fiction, more of his acting. I didn't realize that he had other books of his adapted, that he was an actor. He shows up in different films, so this was a real eye-opener for me to know about this character that I never really knew about before, the actual author of Midnight Cowboy. And also, I'll be honest, to learn a lot more about Waldo Salt, the screenwriter, and to learn how he injected himself into so much of this. You know, Chris, you mentioned that documentary. I love that you get the shot of him drawing on a postcard and like, this is me. And then you get that later on in the movie of Joe Buck doing that. I like that they took all of these stories from real life too, like the body in front of, I don't remember if that was Tiffany's or where that was, and everybody just stepping over it, and Joe looking down and just being so amazed that people aren't helping this person out. But that's the city. That's the big, mean city. Other movies where people will talk about how horrible New York is. I mean, Taxi Driver's yet to come in this timeline, but I love just the wide-eyed innocence of like, what? Nobody's helping this person out? It's like, sorry, we got places to go and places to be.
Yeah, I often wonder what the story is. It'd be great if you could have a little sideline and we find out, why is this guy on the pavement outside of Tiffany's? What's happened there? Is his engagement gone wrong or something? What's happened? And then there are the other the characters, some of them recurring characters. The strung out mother with a mouse, with a toy mouse, and her son in the cafe, just running the mouse over the son's arms and head. What's going on there?
But then I think she shows up again.
Yeah, if that is her, it might not even be her, but it could well be her, which is the strung out woman who's flitting between the doorways. And I guess they're there to show Joe's alienation from his environment, really. He is going, I don't understand what's happening here. But I think a lot of that arose from actual observation on Schlesinger's part when he first got to America. And I don't think he'd actually been to America before, or he hadn't spent very much time in America before Midnight Cowboy. So he brought that outsider's eye to the things that were going on. And I remember reading an interview where he says that the wonderful thing about a place like New York is that all of these dramas have been played out in public, whereas back in England, they'd all be happening behind closed doors. And he found that really fascinating that would be happening. But there's also, you say, what Waldo Salt brought to it was this whole thing about the media and the media's influence on people. The things like Joe's kind of sitting in the bathtub watching the pay TV where you got to put the coins into the TV, and he's watching the poodle that's being sort of dressed up on the television. And the other stuff about the media, the orange juice ad and all of the other things, the use of the media. I think you mentioned this earlier, Michael, when you wrote it in your sort of menu thing about what that little news piece about what do you look for in a man, where women on the street are being questioned. What is it they look for in a man? I think that Waldo Salt's kind of like having gone through the 60s, it really was asking about the influence of the media on people's psyches there. And that even going back to that little boy that's outside of, sitting on the little play horse in front of the abandoned cinema screen in his cowboy outfit saying, "Is that Joe Buck?" It could also be seen as a comment on the influence of cinema on people's psyche. The idea that we've all grown up with cowboy movies. We all have this idea of the cowboy persona, even up to the sort of Marlboro Man, and the idea that's what makes masculinity and so on and so forth. So there's so many layers to the movie, and one of those layers is that sort of idea of the media and media messages being contrasted with this harsh socio-economic reality of Joe Buck and Ratso's lives.
So much of this movie has to do with screens. You know, you start with that screen. It almost looks like that drive-in movie screen is outside of Joe Buck's little room that he's in. And then you've got, the sex that he has with Crazy Annie is behind a screen at a movie theater. I don't know if they really make that apparent in the movie, but that's definitely there in the book. And then the blowjob with Bob Balaban. I mean, that's one reason why they're flashing back between what's going on with Bob Balaban and then what's going on with Joe in his memory, and flashing back to Crazy Annie and basically trying to dredge up good memories to help him complete. And then, you've got the TV screens, and you've got all of the TV that goes on when he's having sex with, I think it's Sylvia Miles. You get all of the flashing images on the TV, and that becomes really, you see more of that than you see of the sex. And even the whole thing, too, of the projection of images. Joe Buck is constantly looking at himself in mirrors or mirrored images, and then talking to himself, just like, you know what you got to do, or like, who is that handsome devil, and slapping his own ass type of thing. It's so much of him, like you said, thinking about that idealized state and trying to be that, trying to project himself onto that and be that TV or movie cowboy when he can't be that. He is not that inherently, but we are shown so many different images throughout this whole thing. Yeah, I love that layer that Salt brought to it. And you've got that video layer, you've got the audible layer. I mean, notice really the last time I was watching this, how you go from everybody's talking at me through so much of this movie to then it just stops playing. And there's a lot of times where there's no music and sometimes no sound, or like Schlesinger will bring in certain sounds that you hear, and the walls are so thin in apartments that, like with the John MacGyver, like that scene, or McGibbon, you can hear the people screaming at him because he's so loud in his own apartment. You can hear the other voices. So we've got everybody's talking, it kind of drops out, and then we go into that John Barry Midnight Cowboy theme, and that gets played several times, which is the loneliest song and one of the most depressing songs. I mean, this musical piece that he has, and then eventually we move back into the Nilsson towards the end, kind of to say, like, things are going to be okay, even though that's a really depressing song as well when you listen to the lyrics.
I love it, though. I love it. I love the song, but it's the perfect song for this movie, right? Like, absolutely underscores the themes and the ideas of the movie perfectly.
The Nilsson song, going back to what you're saying, Mike, is that this thing about Joe Buck's identity, that's his problem. He doesn't know who he is. Who am I? I'm Joe Buck, but who's Joe Buck? Is he a man? Is he a queer? Is he a stud? Is he a husband? Or is he a son? He just doesn't have a clue. And it's even more difficult because everybody's talking at me. You've got all these images bombarding him, saying this is what you should be. You should be a cowboy. You should be this. You should be that. And I think a lot of the way we identify with him because of that. You go, yeah, most of us are confused throughout our lives, trying to make sense of our lives, trying to make sense of our identity or find our identity. And I think maybe that's why I found the film so powerful to me when I was 16 or 17, and why a lot of audiences do find it so powerful, because they really identify with this thing about Joe, who just doesn't really know how to proceed with his life and be his true self.
You get those few moments where Joe is flush with cash, where he is very, very happy, and, comes in, he's just, oh, I got this, I got that. And I love how Ratso kind of undermines him, like, well, I could have stolen that. I could have shoplifted so much of the things that you are buying. Why are you even bothering to buy this? But yeah, he goes out when he finally scores, when he scores with Brenda Vaccaro towards the end of the film, he immediately goes out and buys all this medicine and buys all this stuff for Ratso. I love that. I love that he has that compassion and that, like you said, he's growing now. He's growing into a real human being, because I think one of the reasons why we do identify with Joe Buck so much is that he is such a cipher. He doesn't have that identity, so we can see ourselves in him a lot better than if he was, I am this, I am that, this is all I will ever be. He is such a fluid character in so many ways that it's very easy for an audience to identify with this person who has no identity.
You can't have an identity without relating to somebody, seems to be what the film is about. That scene is so powerful, that turning point in his character, because he's literally left Ratso out in the cold, in the snow. He's with Brenda Vaccaro and he can't get it up because he's worrying about Ratso. Ratso's there in the back of his mind for the well-being of his friend. And then the film really is almost slips into really pinpointing the sort of queer aspect of it a little too much in some ways, because there's the questioning of his identity where Brenda puts a little bit the words out on the Scrabble board with his gay, is that your problem? And then, of course, he's faced with that choice that suddenly there's a possibility of him achieving the thing he's always been aiming for throughout the film, that he may well have cracked it with the high society ladies who've got all their friends who can provide him with further clients, but he is forced into making a choice, making a decision at that point as does he abandon Ratso for this dream, or does he decide to stay with his friend and look after his friend, and that's what he decides to do.
Well, I like the idea that even at the we've talked about Joe Buck going to New York at the beginning of the movie and the idealized version of what he's getting himself into. I also like the idea that the note that the movie ends on is they were going to, once again, an idealized version of somewhere else. What does that mean? And we never find out what that means, but to leave the characters where they leave them, as opposed to the doors opening on the bus and them walking out. I think it, again, to further reinforce this idea of you might get what you want, but you might not know that what you're getting is not at all what you need. But again, like ultimately the characters do get what they need in this movie to get to that point. But, oh man, yeah.
Because there's the moment where Joe's on the bus and he says, you know what, I've been thinking, because I ain't any kind of hustler. I'm just going to get a job. What kind of a job? Just some outdoor work. And in the book, that's really expanded that actually Joe is going to get married in his own mind. He is going to get married. Doesn't even have to be a blonde woman. He's going to get married. But Ratso is going to be living with him almost as their child because of his disability and so on. So they're going to look after him. So it's a very interesting conclusion for Joe in the book, which is more kind of concluded, is the idea that Joe is planning now to live a kind of a normal life, a kind of ostensibly heterosexual life, but not quite. There's the fact that his relationship with Ratso, with another man, is the key relationship that's really opened him as a person, that's provided his sort of therapy in order to become a whole person. And maybe the book and the film are talking about the idea that love can take any form. It's just that love itself is the important thing. It doesn't matter who it's with as long as it's reciprocated.
All right, we're going to take a break and we'll be back with an interview with Glenn Frankel, the author of Shooting Midnight Cowboy, Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic, right after these brief messages.
Join me, Jamie Benning, on the Filmumentaries podcast, particularly if you enjoy stories like designer Nilo Rodis Jamiro convincing George Lucas to push him around to help gain the support of his crew on the ailing Howard the Duck.
Blam, the door opens, it's George. Everybody gasps. George makes a beeline to me. I'm literally back against the wall.
Or hear puppeteer Tim Rose's emotional story behind that iconic Admiral Akbar shot in Return of the Jedi.
I believe that war is something to be proud of, but not to celebrate.
Or how Star Wars editor Paul Hirsch tackled cutting so many successful films.
The thing that I learned from working with De Palma is that tension depends on a clock. You need to have the sense that time is running out.
Maybe Oscar-winning sound designer Mark Mangini's insightful chat about his work on Blade Runner 2049.
Not a single sound from the original Blade Runner in the new film. A great deal of inspiration.
That's the Filmumentaries podcast with me, Jamie Benning.
Obviously, I want to ask you about your Midnight Cowboy book, but really curious about you because you've been writing for a while, and I'm curious how you got into it.
I was a longtime Washington Post reporter, even foreign correspondent. When I got back to the States after a long time overseas, I didn't want to, I think being a foreign correspondent gets stale pretty fast when you're not actually there. Witness the things we're hearing now over the Israeli-Palestinian war. Anyway, I wanted to do an American book, and I'd always loved The Searchers. That's pretty American, I thought. What thrilled me as a kid, there had never been a book except for that one of those little British Film Institute books, which are lovely, but there'd never been a full-scale book. I was out at Stanford University teaching journalism, and I could get to LA, I could get to Monument Valley. So I started out with that, and it worked really well, and I enjoyed it. I found out, like the first weekend, that there actually was a true story way back at the beginning about a 9-year-old girl who'd been kidnapped by Comanches in East Texas in the 1830s. And that was the basis for a lot of Texas legend, frontier legendary figures. And if we'd gone to high school in Texas, we would have had it as part of the curriculum. But I grew up in Rochester, New York. That opened up a whole new part of it for me. I wasn't just writing about a movie. I was writing about a true event. And that was something, my training, if you will, at the Washington Post was very useful for, because I'd been overseas. I'd cover these kinds of conflicts of two sides fighting over the same piece of land, two sides really trying to destroy each other. And the Texas and Comanche wars had gone on for 40 years. They were the longest war on American soil and really brutal. So I ended up writing a book that wasn't just about the movie, but was about the legend and how the movie just becomes part of the legend. And I stumbled from that one into High Noon and the Hollywood Blacklist, which was an obvious thing and right up my alley in terms of politics, and discovered that I always thought High Noon was a good movie, but I didn't think it was a great movie. But we held a little session down at the University of Texas where Charles Ramirez-Berg, a film studies professor who actually knows a lot about movies, made the case for High Noon. And again, I just fell into it. Midnight Cowboy is a much newer movie and much more modern movie and more contemporary in its values and in its concerns. And it just seemed like a logical way to go after doing those two sort of classical Westerns. I could do a movie about a guy who pretends to be a cowboy and who's moving east rather than west. And it just fit for a lot of reasons. The first thing you look for, has anybody else done this? Is there a really good movie book? That's kept me away from Citizen Kane and The Godfather and a lot of things I'd love to write about, but they've been done and done really well over the years. But Midnight Cowboy, again, fell into that category of touched upon in biographies of, say, John Schlesinger and other people, but never really focused on. And it turned out to be really a great gift. It's such an interesting, complex movie. Plus, a lot of the people who made it are still alive and were happy to talk to me about it. So I feel like I really lucked into a movie that may be just a little bit underrated. Certainly John Schlesinger, the director, is underrated. I would say he's not in the new Hollywood pantheon with Scorsese or even Mike Nichols or Spielberg, all those people. He's a little left outside of that for a lot of reasons. But I think Midnight Cowboy holds up as well or even better than almost any of the movies of that era. It's more groundbreaking. It's the only X-rated movie to win the Best Picture Oscar. There's a story behind that, which we can get into if you like. But it also was a movie that reflected that era. And it's a very anxious, difficult era in American politics and in American life. And yet at the same time, culturally, it's a very fizzy, interesting, lively time when things are changing in the culture. And certainly things are changing in Hollywood. So it gave me a lot of ground to cover and a lot of interesting things to write about. So I just dived in and found myself way over my head and just tried to float to the surface. If you work at these things long enough, you pretend in any way that, or you tell yourself that you know what you're talking about. I really love doing it. I love the people I met. So I felt very lucky.
So when you put on your reporter's cap and dive into a new project like that, what's your method? How do you even go about doing your research on things? Because that was the thing, because I read your High Noon book. I've read the Midnight Cowboy book. I want to read the Searcher's book. The breadth of all of the information that you're bringing to me is fantastic.
I appreciate the comment. I'm well trained. I'd been a reporter for a long time, and you're often thrown into new situations and have 24 hours or less to come up with something. The great thing about writing these kinds of books is I have all the time I need. And the first thing is to try to read everything I can to know what's out there and read about these really interesting people, and then try to figure out how I can reach them. Now, some of them I can't reach because they've passed away. Some of them are very hard to reach, like Dustin Hoffman or Jon Voight, who are still very, while their era of being big time celebrities may be over, they still were very big in their time, especially Hoffman. I begin the long process of reading about them and strategizing about how I might get to them. It's just accumulating all kinds of information. The thing about writing about a great Hollywood movie is there's a lot you can gather. There's a lot I need to know about the era. It helped with Midnight Cowboy a bit that I was young and in New York when this movie was made and the time this movie reflects. I was going to Columbia University and I was like, I think 19 when I saw Midnight Cowboy for the first time. So I have my own sense of what New York was like. And even though I'm not in the book at all, it really does reflect my own feelings and experiences of the period and going to movies, becoming a movie person all through that time. I bit off a big subject, both in terms of the movie and in terms of the era. And you just read everything and then figure out where the archives are. I've done this. This is my third making of the movie book. So I know the Motion Picture Academy Library pretty well. I've got pals, the New York Public Library at the Billy Rose Library there. I've got archivists are my best friends. It's like gathering sources to do a news story almost. You collect people who you admire and who know a lot and who know a lot more than you do. And then for each of these books, I've gone back to these people and they've helped me and they've steered me to other people. Of course, you build almost a tree of a phone tree, an email tree, and you just see. And the lovely thing with Midnight Cowboy, as I suggested earlier, almost everyone involved in it, they're awfully good. They were the best. Jerry Hellman, the producer, put together a wonderful group of people. Schlesinger was involved in it. They got Marion Doherty, the great casting director who I'd never heard of. Yet she's so crucial to the movie. And unfortunately, she's passed away, but there's a documentary that's done on Marion. She wrote a memoir. She has friends, some of the people who worked for her at the time. It's like natural. Just go around and acquire what you can and look for the holes and acquire more. And one person leads you to the next one, as I say, and one interesting document leads you to the next. And I'm finding out all kinds of interesting things as I go along. For example, that Marion was bitter that she didn't get a single card credit, how that happened, what that meant, why she doesn't get that kind of listing, even though she's so crucial to the movie. What the X rating was really about and why it is X rated was another story that I actually heard. I'm trying to remember who first told me there was something wiggy about that. But eventually I just found Steve Farber, who was on the on the board as the student representative of the ratings board. So I got to Steve. He'd written his own little book about it way back in the early 70s. And so the fact that the ratings board actually rated it R, and that United Artists, the head of United Artists, was uncomfortable because this is a movie with some sex in it. It's all cold and transactional, but some of it's gay sex and some of it's straight sex. And he just was really uncomfortable with that. And that, what I loved about that was it told you something about the era. He really did believe that if young men like me or you watch that movie, it could affect us and cause us, I don't know, to turn gay. I'm not quite sure, because they thought of homosexuality not only as a disease, but as a contagious disease. It was like COVID. And writing about all of that, just the doors begin to open, other doors open. This one was the richest one I've done yet, I think, in terms of really being able to go deep into these things and learning a lot that I had no idea. I just gaily waltzed into this thing, as I do in every book, knowing that I don't know a lot, and then having the wonderful experience. And it is fun to research these things, getting all this material. So I just started at the beginning. It was more clear to me in this process that the stories that people tell about themselves and about things like Midnight Cowboy, sometimes they're not all true. Even with the people like Jerry Hellman, who was wonderful to me, the producer. Jerry had suffered a serious, massive stroke years earlier, and everything was difficult for him, but he couldn't have been more warm and glad to see me, and his wife was very helpful. But Jerry is the one who's partly peddled the story. They rated it X. After we won the Best Picture Oscar, they wanted to put it down to R, but they asked, if we just take out one frame, can we take out one frame so they can claim it's been edited? That's just not true. That just didn't happen. And Jerry and John Schlesinger, who also told that story, refused to take out one frame, and yet the board gave them their R. Okay. So I learned that. I think the biggest surprise to me was to learn how much homophobia there was in liberal, tolerant, politically correct New York City in the 1960s. Late in the game, people weren't demanding that gay people be put in prison, but still there was this sense, and I attribute some of it to the priesthood, to the Freudian psychiatric priesthood of the era, who had a lot of influence in New York. Everybody who had enough money was in analysis. It's like a bad Woody Allen movie. And so that sense of wisdom to discover that conversion therapy wasn't invented in the basement of some Baptist church in Arkansas, but in the offices of psychiatrists all over Manhattan. And so learning about that and reading things in the New York Review of Books or the New York Times that were rather shocking. Looking back at it and interviewing people from that era, it's not that surprising. But that, to me at the time, I wasn't expecting that to be as intense as it was, and therefore helps explain why Midnight Cowboy is such a groundbreaking movie. That was probably my biggest single surprise.
I was really glad how in-depth you went into the music, and I had never realized that was not a song written by Nilsson. I thought for sure that Nilsson always did his own work.
He mostly did, and he didn't want to do Everybody's Talking. His producer, Rick Gerard, talked him into it because they needed one more song, Rick thought, and Rick had heard the song, the original. That much I knew because I'd been in New York at that era, and I knew who Fred Neil was. My brother is a great guitar player, and he and I grew up on people like Fred Neil and these kinds of songs. So I knew that Fred created it, but John Schlesinger heard Nielsen's version from Ariel Ballet. Nielsen only did it, as I say, to placate his producer. He wanted only his own songs on it. And the song is crucial to the movie. That song, and then the song that John Barry created, the instrumental, the Midnight Cowboy theme, the harmonica theme. Those are wonderful songs. And anyone who's seen that movie, they're in your head and you never leave them. Schlesinger loved the enigmatic feel of Everybody's Talking, that it's not a narrative. It's not like in High Noon, Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling, where you're getting the story of the movie told literally. Schlesinger found something much more, as I say, enigmatic, to the center of Joe Buck's soul from that song. And I think such a beautiful song. We all feel something from it, and it's so rhythmic. And the way Nielsen does it is so wonderful, of course. And Schlesinger strings it all through the movie, uses it over and over in ways. And it's a major factor, I think, in why people remember that movie and why the movie's so good. Every contributor is at the top of their game in that movie. Marion, John Barry, composer, the man in charge of the music, Schlesinger himself. There are so many people, the supporting actors, not to mention Hoffman and Voight. They're all, and that's why costume designer Anne Roth, the star of Barbie, she's got a 10-second role in Barbie, and she's terrific. And she's the key to the movie in some ways. Anne Roth, and that didn't surprise me because she's got that kind of personality. And she designed every costume for that movie, she said. Everything. And it fits perfectly too. So I'm not downgrading the auteur theory. I'm not either pro or anti-auteur theory, but in this movie really is the collective effort of a wonderfully talented group of people.
What was the toughest information for you to dig out, or what were some of the toughest parts of putting the book together?
I start out always thinking, if I don't talk to, say, Hoffman and Voight, it's no big deal because they've given so many interviews and I'll just use those. But immediately when I tell anyone I'm working on a book about Midnight Cowboy, their first question is, have you been able to talk to Hoffman and Voight? And after a while, it was annoying at first. It was hard. Voight wasn't that hard to get in the end. My reporting skills came in handy. Voight makes a lot of small movies these days, and he made one in Wisconsin. And he gave a Wisconsin reporter an interview because that's part of the job, to sell the movie. And I got to the Wisconsin reporter and said, how'd you get to Voight? And he got me to a PR woman in LA who wasn't supposed to help someone like me. They'd only done PR for the movie, but she was a very nice person. Her name was Liz Rodriguez. And she said, she works in the same building as Voight's office. So she literally walked up there and told them I'd been writing them and getting nothing. And Liz got me through. Hoffman was even harder. He has PR people who work for him who I think their only real job is to make sure he never knows that someone like me is trying to talk to him. He was a very big movie star, and he still has a lot of infrastructure to take care of him. And it was right after the Me Too movement, which singed him a bit. And so he really was lying low, but I managed to make friends with his brother, Ron. I'm real friends with his brother, Ron. We're good friends now. And Ron knew what I was looking for, and Ron helped me out. So eventually I got to Hoffman, and it was great. And the reason I needed to talk to these guys wasn't that they hadn't talked about the movie many times, but I was particularly interested in their working together because this is really a joint performance. Voight's in every scene. Hoffman is not. But the heart of the movie is the relationship and the evolving partnership of these two men who are God's loneliest creatures. And Hoffman, this was Voight's first movie and really one of Hoffman's early movies. He'd done The Graduate. He was a big star all of a sudden. Nonetheless, he wanted to play this character part. And so the two of them challenged each other. They helped each other. They had known each other before, but they weren't friends or anything. And yet here they are. And I think they're fabulous. And so talking to each of them about the other was very useful for me and really was important to the way I viewed these two guys and what I wrote about them, which isn't anything terribly original based on on other things that have been written. But I think it emphasized a little more, as I say, this collaborative effort, what it was like to work with each other, what it was like to work with Schlesinger. And I just thought they were fabulous to talk to about these things.
How did you get involved in the documentary?
Nancy Bursky called me up after she looked at the book. She'd looked at my other two books too. And at first she wasn't sure which one she wanted to do, but this one made a lot of sense to her. I'd never heard of Nancy. This is a woman who, a little bit like me, she'd moved in her career as a documentarian in her early 60s after a wonderful career of doing many other things and being a photo editor at the New York Times. And she had made some really terrific movies. And so I looked them up. She sent them to me. And her approach was she didn't want to just do a making of the movie. documentary, she wanted to do something about New York and about America. Her vision of what that was far wider than mine in the book. I stick mostly to New York and to Hollywood and things changing there, Nancy. And so I thought, why not? But this was all Nancy's doing. I helped her as much as I could, but from the beginning, it was clear it was her movie, not mine. And so I'm amazed at what she did in the end, because she really fulfilled her vision of it. It's a her sense of visual imagery and how to move from one thing to another, and her almost like stream of consciousness connecting of things, again, partly using the material, the images and the music and everything, I thought was really quite wonderful. And I can take no credit for that. It's all Nancy. I can't do structure like that. I just do narrative structure. This happened and that happened. That's all I know how to do. But Nancy really went every place she wanted to go. So I'm so glad she did it. Sadly, she passed away just as it was coming out, really. But I'm glad it got out. I'm glad she finished it. I'm glad it got out because I think it's a real tribute to her. And she's done other great movies, but I think this is really her ultimate statement of all she'd learned. And I'm just so sorry she's not here to enjoy the more. She saw some lovely reviews and she got some audience reactions, but boy, it'd be so much more if she were still around.
Have you picked the subject for your next book yet?
I'm chuckling because, I've been working for a couple of years now on a book about Brian Epstein and the rise of the Beatles. And it's been really hard, much harder than the movie books. There's so much written about the Beatles, but there's only a bit written about Brian. And he was a very private man in many ways. And he had never really, he was Jewish, he was gay, he was utterly devoted to them. And so I thought he would be a great way to retell the founding story, but from the point of view of someone who was really essential to it, someone who, without him, it wouldn't have happened. And yet at the same time, someone who's a bit overlooked for a variety of reasons. It's been really tough. I'm almost done with a draft. I don't have a publisher. I'm not sorry I did. I'd like to get back and do another movie book or two because they're simpler, but I'll get this done and hopefully someone will publish it, Mike, and maybe you'll put me back on. We could talk about A Hard Day's Night or something cinematic.
I would love that. When it comes to the movie books, how do you make your choice, or do they choose you?
As I said, Searchers was pretty straightforward. I'd loved it since I was a kid. When I got back to America, I needed an American book, and Searchers, what's more American than John Wayne and John Ford going to Miami Valley? High Noon came up because I was already at the University of Texas when Searchers came out, and we did a little sort of series of cowboy movies. I did Searchers with the head of the radio, TV, film department, Paul Steckler. Then Charles Ramirez Berg did High Noon. He made it sound so interesting, and I'd seen it and I'd liked it a lot. So I just researched a little, found that no one had done it before. I had to ask myself, do you really want to be a movie book writer? Doing Searchers, that's one thing. But if you do High Noon, you're going to be a movie book writer. And I thought, why the hell not? A really interesting movie. And The Blacklist is an amazing, incredibly anxious, difficult moment in American history, not unlike the moment we're in now. So for me, an old Washington Post reporter, that was fine. That was fine. And so I've just stumbled along from one movie to the other. I still haven't been on a movie set. I don't know many people in Hollywood, but the people I do know are incredibly helpful. People like the late Nick Redman, who knows more about movie music and about how things are done and why Schlesinger used Everybody's Talking and how he used it. The High Noon music, which is also essential. So people like Nick have been so helpful to me. And I have a group of sources, as reporters would call them, out there. So if I do another movie book, that's fine. It fits my sensibility and my time in life. I love writing books because nobody cares what I'm doing. My wife would like to know if we're going to LA or somewhere. But other than that, when I sign a deal, nobody bothers me. Nobody says, oh, you ought to write this way or that way. I can do whatever I want. And at my, advanced age, I like that freedom and I take full advantage of it. I'm very fortunate. I got the best training you could get to write about anything. And I've taken full advantage of it. It's great. And movies, I love these movies. They're so interesting. And I don't know a lot about movies per se, but I know a hell of a lot about 3 movies. And I know them very well. And so I just stumbled into it, and I'm just one fortunate son of a bitch.
I look forward to the next one. I definitely want to read the Brian Epstein one, and then whatever you come up with next, because you're doing great work.
That's very kind of you. As I said, I feel very fortunate. I always try to look for a movie that hasn't been done, or at least not in the way I'm going to do it. And there are plenty of them still out there. I feel very lucky.
Thank you so much for your time today. This was fantastic.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate your doing this.
Everybody's talking at me.
I would say it was one of the best I've seen this year.
All right, if you like that type of picture.
First movie in a long time that moved me enough to just get on the verge of tears.
Whatever you hear about Midnight Cowboy is true.
Parts of it are grotesque.
Fabulous.
Frightening.
Started to depress me.
Terribly contemporary.
Whatever you hear about Midnight Cowboy is true.
All that I expected it to be. Morbid, filthy.
I thought it was tremendous.
Touching. Disgusting. I thought it was terrific, and I'm really not in shape to talk about it right now.
Dustin Hoffman.
He's grown up since The Graduate.
Jon Voight.
He is something else.
Midnight Cowboy. In color from United Artists. Entertainment from Transamerica Corporation.
It's so real. It was very pitiful, tremendous. I'm using all these adjectives, but they are that good.
Everybody's talking at me.
This picture has been rated X.
All right, we are back, and we are talking about Midnight Cowboy, and we've made several references to the documentary about Midnight Cowboy, Desperate Souls, Dark City, and the Legend of Midnight Cowboy. Very, very interesting documentary. The way that Nancy, is it Bursky? The way that she put it together, I really like this type of filmmaking. It feels kind of stream of consciousness, but it's definitely not. You can tell that there are themes that she's dealing with and then moving from one to the other to the other. And John, I'm really curious about your take on that since you are so familiar with this film. What were your thoughts on the documentary?
I agree. I think it's a very interesting way of doing it, and I think it's kind of remains true to the spirit of the film in a way, and also to the spirit of the novel, and to just to the discourses that are arising from the novel and the film. There's so many discourses coming out from Glenn's book, from my book, from the documentaries, the things you were talking about, that kind of looking back New York and representations of New York at the time, Vietnam, Stonewall, and all of these things, of course, are interconnected in a sort of in a socio-political sense. I think it was very beautifully woven together in the documentary.
I liked it a lot. It reminded me, not so much in what it was driving at, but just the way it's presented, of Rodney Asher's Room 237, in terms of just like that stream of consciousness. And obviously that's about a movie. This is about a movie as well. So that kind of helps in terms of how it's being presented. But I love a documentarian that has a unique way of doing things. And yeah, I resonated a lot with the documentary. I enjoyed it a lot. It was really well done. And yeah, anyone who's willing to take a format like documentary and pare it down and really give the audience, like, I'm just going to give you enough and you need to trust me as the filmmaker that I know what I'm doing. That is the way I came to this documentary, because again, that doesn't hold your hand, and it doesn't need to. And I think that's what I enjoyed about it the most, is that she does a great job in conveying what she needs to get across without beating you over the head with it constantly with talking heads. Like, so much of it is presented just with, again, just like moving pictures with no explanation.
Yeah, the cross-cutting, the going from one image to the next and just showing you the similarities, the differences, just those counterpoints, I thought was really, really well done. And when it comes to the talking heads, I was really so glad to see the way that she used this very shallow depth of field, and so that people would kind of come in and out of focus as they're moving through. You get that a lot with Jon Voight, and to have a non-crazy Jon Voight in this documentary was really nice as well. It's like, I guess if you keep him on target and keep him like talking about the past, you're going to be okay. But I mean, this is one of the few films that he hasn't gone back and said, oh, I was wrong for making this, or I was being manipulated by the liberal media. Like Coming Home, one of his other fantastic roles that he had. Now he just like, oh, no. Forget that. That was all liberal media garbage. I don't associate me with that stuff. But luckily he hasn't sold out when it comes to Midnight Cowboy. So there is that. He was great in it. Everybody that she talked to really brought a lot to the conversation, and just, especially really talking about what it was like to be homosexual in the late 60s in New York. And just that this movie happened to coincide very closely with the Stonewall riots. I was really glad that you can kind of go beyond the four corners of the screen and see what the rest of the world was like, both right before and right after this.
You did mention Jon Voight not being full crazy, but there is a moment in the documentary where it seems like he's about to go and be like, and it was when they were talking about him. I guess he was being asked by Abby Hoffman to say, oh, I don't want my Oscar nomination. And there's that moment where they're talking to him where he really wants to be like, I don't believe in that bullshit anymore. He's like there at that moment, but I think he realized like this probably isn't the setting for this. So he backs off of it a little bit. But yeah, I think it's like Robert Davi, unfortunately. Like I enjoy the things that I've seen them in, but this day and age, unfortunately, we know it's like with pro wrestling. It's now I know the secrets. Now I know everything. Now I know the way that you are. And I can't unknow that, unfortunately. And especially if there's nothing wrong with being outspoken. As far as I'm concerned, like it's not a matter of being canceled or not. It's about finding your audience. And if you want that specific audience and you want those people to listen to you and you have a belief that your opinion matters more to them, be my guest. Not for me, but all right. But yeah, it was like there was a moment where he was like, he could have gone there and he chose not to. I was like, man, a little bit of self-restraint being practiced. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see the outtakes around this one.
Don't ask me about Coming Home, though. I have no interest in talking about that. All right, Jesus, John.
It's one of those things that you think, what do I separate the art from the artist? I mean, because he's still a great actor. Ray Donovan, he was fantastic in that TV show. Well, yeah, you just go, spoiling it for me. knowing what is really what his views are is spoiling it a little bit. But I still think he's a great actor even today, despite himself.
It is hard to do, but I think if you do what we do, which is watch a lot of movies and a lot of television, I think you owe it to the people that are listening to you or reading what you write to try to be somewhat objective about this. And yeah, like his politics aside, like if Jon Voight retired after this movie, you'd still be talking about Jon Voight in this movie. Like that, this role in Midnight Cowboy is such a defining role that if this was his only role, we would still be talking about it in 2023. This movie would still be relevant, even without all the other things that he would go on to do, Coming Home and Deliverance.
It's him and Hoffman together, really, isn't it? It's that kind of, the dynamic between them is really extraordinary. I think they were talking about getting Michael Sarrazin to do Joe Buck, weren't they, originally? Which is like of an actor, he's made no impression on me whatsoever. I've seen him in the Frankenstein, The True Story. He played the creature in that, and I think he's in things like the Gumball Rally and stuff, but I don't really...
He sure is.
As far as I know, his career really didn't go anywhere, or at least he's not made any impression on me at all. So I just think that was an incredible piece of good luck on Schlesinger's behalf. And I think actually Schlesinger was pressing for Sarrazin. I don't think he wanted Jon Voight, and he realised later that he was mistaken. And he maybe when he saw a few of the scenes that Voight was doing, he realised that Voight was absolutely the right choice for this. But it just goes to show that just that wrong casting decision, and we wouldn't be talking about Midnight Cowboy probably And what was the other movie he was in with Joan Fonda? It was a good movie, Sidney Pollack. They shoot horses, don't they? You seen that movie? It's a good movie, but again, I don't remember anything about Michael Sarrazin. And this is not to denigrate Michael Sarrazin. It's just the roles he's taken just don't seem to have allowed him to do anything particularly memorable in his own right. It just seems to be a foil to other people. And I think if he had have been cast as Joe Buck, it would have turned into Dustin Hoffman's movie. And just imagine the kind of imbalance that would have created, because it's not really Ratso's story, it's Joe Buck's story. Yeah, but for the grace of God goes the casting agent.
Yeah, it sounds like Sarrazin's people priced him out of the movie, and they were like, "Oh, well, we'll go back to the pile," and the pile had Jon Voight at the top. Sarrazin, to your point, he and kind of to my point from earlier, he is also a cipher. He is nothing in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? I mean, I like his performance, but it's people acting upon him. It's not him acting upon people. It really becomes the other people in the film. It really is Jane Fonda's movie when it comes down to it, because her personality is a lot bigger than his in that one. So yeah, I'm really glad that we dodged that bullet. Nothing against Michael Sarrazin. He was great in Gumball Rally, and he's been good in other things that I've seen, but yeah, this is Jon Voight's real piece de resistance.
When you see Voight's screen test for Midnight Cowboy, is not fully a Joe Buck yet, but there's so many things there that you think, how could they not have seen that? There's a moment where I think Waldorf Salt's off screen feeding him lines and doing an improv, and he says, "Would you make it with a man?" And Voight says, "I'd make it with a fucking sheep." And you just think, that is kind of Joe Buck from the novel. When an actor gets the sense of the character, gets the smell of the character, I think that's then the casting's right. But you do wonder what all the kind of politics behind the scenes about, and you bring in the whole thing about packaging and agents and the studio pressuring, wanting certain people, and who wants who, and how do you think straight? I think a lot of it was just good luck that Voight was cast in the end.
So I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the porn parody of Midnight Cowboy. Or at least you would think it would be the porn parody, because it is called Midnight Plowboy from 1971. The poster says, "Meet the original Hollywood hillbilly as he plows the fertile fields of sirens and starlets in a nonstop search for the most willing women in the world." It is the story of another hick who goes to the big city. This time he's looking to go to Hollywood and he doesn't really have a motivation. He doesn't want to be a male prostitute. He just seems really dumb. He captures the dumbness of Joe Buck. It is Jon Towlson as Jr., and we get to see him get picked up in a car at the beginning, and the wife of this couple moves to the back seat with him and starts fooling around with him. But I quickly found out within the first few minutes of this movie, this is a softcore film, not hardcore. There was no penetration whatsoever. There was just a lot of boobs and butts and kissing. I think you get to see genitals, which is more than you do really a lot with Midnight Cowboy, but they're not being put to use explicitly, let's say. So it was a strange movie. It's got a great theme song, but then they end up using that, the melody for that through the entire rest of the film, where it's non-stop music, where when you turn off the movie, which I did very quickly, you feel a sense of relief because you don't have to listen to that music anymore. But basically, Junior, just so for folks that want to know, Junior ends up driving a portable whorehouse. He ends up living with all of these prostitutes, and their pimp buys this van. It's kind of a Winnebago. It's very similar to a movie that you and I discussed, Chris. It's very similar to Citizen's Band as far as the mobile whorehouse that they have in that. So, but yeah, it's not that good, but it's worth the price of the admission for just the theme song and the incredible credits, which are just basically people's names written down in chalk on the street, and you follow Junior along as he goes past each one of the credits. So not nearly as inventive as the credit sequence in Midnight Cowboy, which I really like that opening sequence.
Well, it's a double feature on Something Weird video with the also hilariously titled Country Cousins with 2 Z's. Cousins spelled Couzins. Yeah. The sexy Southern double feature, as Something Weird video was selling it. Great. I think we should use this as an opportunity to mention, and you already mentioned it, this movie's rated X. Sure. That was the thing that I had always heard about Midnight Cowboy before seeing it was rated X. And when I watched it, again, after having done all the research and everything, understanding why and for what reason and everything, just watching this is the most tame X-rated movie I've ever seen. Beyond even Airplane is less tame than this movie. And that movie's rated PG. It was shocking to me because, again, all right, if you're going to rate it X for the reason you rated it for, go for it. But tell me that's not discrimination. Tell me that there's not another reason for that, because that's what it was.
Well, I want to thank you guys so much for joining me to talk about Midnight Cowboy. This has been a blast. So, Chris, what is going on in your world, sir?
Staying busy making podcasts over at weirdingwaymedia.com, where you and I work on plenty of stuff monthly. And then I have a weekly movie podcast called The Kulturecast, where I talk about movies similar to this, but similar to this.
And John, as the Americans say, what's the haps with you?
Just put out another book. It's called 40 Cult Movies. So check that out. And we talked about this, actually, when we recorded your podcast on Dawn of the Dead. And you said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm thinking of writing a book called 40 Cult Movies. I wrote the book. It's now out on Amazon. So check it out.
I definitely will. I always enjoy your books, John, so I will be sure to pick that one up as well.
Thank you, Mike, for inviting me on. Brilliant talking about this movie with you both. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everybody for listening. And thank you so much. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, like Chris said, check out the other shows that we work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projection booth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.